Afternoon, everybody. It's morning where I am, but wherever you are, good day. I'm drinking my coffee. As you can see, I am back in my office after a couple weeks of adventures around Washington State, where I live. I've decided to transition away from mindfulness. I did a few weeks, and although it was fantastic, it was also a bit exhausting, and so I'm still trying to work on it, but I'm going to transition to some of my other books that I've also been reading because there's a lot of really interesting material that I'm going through this summer. So for this week, I decided to focus on the Quest for Moral Leaders, specifically chapter 6. This is a chapter written by Peter Temes. I'm hoping I'm saying his last name right. But it's about necessary sin and ethics, getting your hands dirty, and the first thing I found incredibly interesting about this chapter, on literally the first page, I'm reading it, and he says this. He says, "For the pacifist, this is not a meaningful moral dilemma, for by definition, the pacifist will choose to suffer any harm, and worse, in my opinion, will choose to have others suffer any harm before seeing war as necessary." And I don't know about you, but for me, I always thought pacifism was not a negative thing. I mean, Muhammad Ali, what a guy, and it's just not something I ever really thought about. And then I'm reading this book and I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, I guess to some extent you could go to an extreme and you can say, you know, I would rather others suffer harm so that I don't have to, because I refuse to, or I'd rather others get their hands dirty so that I can say I have, you know, I am morally clean, whatever that means. But yeah, and so I read that, and my fiance was right next to me, and so I'm talking to him about it, and he brought up a very good point of World War II. He thought, you know, if you think about how long the United States waited to enter the war, now we can look back on history and was that right for us to wait that long? On one hand, we sacrificed a lot of lives in war, but on the other hand, there was a Holocaust and millions of people were being murdered and mistreated. And so he was saying that in that case, the moral thing to do was actually to go to war, to get involved. And I agree with him. I agree. I think if we had totally stayed out of it and just allowed that type of human suffering to continue and not get involved, in my opinion, I think that would have been immoral. So we had a great conversation about it. And so later on in the chapter, as we're reading it, Temes, again, I hope I'm saying his last name right, but Temes goes through this like list. It's a guideline for committing what he calls necessary sin as a leader. He, prior to that, explains that as a leader, there might come times where you have to either get your hands dirty to make a deal with someone who is immoral in order to provide your constituents or your followers with something they need. So you can justify the necessary sin in order to get good out of that situation. Or he talks about how sometimes it's the leader's responsibility to do what will better the lives of their followers, but not necessarily make their followers happy. So there's also there's that quandary to think about, that sometimes there's a requirement of a temporary sacrifice for a long-term happiness, and followers might not see that, and it might be up to the leader to make that decision. So the 3 guidelines he talks about, and I do have my little notes here, but the first is to identify the good. So you're in, like I just said, so you might have to necessarily like improve your followers' well-being, but not necessarily make them happy. And leaders might have to make decisions that followers don't like. And so that's the first guideline, identify the good. Second, isolate what really matters by looking at the problem in a broader context. So sometimes I take this as we can get really bogged down into the details. We can get so involved that it's important to take a step back and really look at the big picture and identify what really matters here, what is actually important, what is the actual goal, and do that. And then third and finally, think of morality at the level of the person rather than the entire group. So in order to better understand, in order for a leader to get a better understanding of their followers, they can, by taking that step back and looking at the individual level of the followers, you can understand the variety and the scope that the followers are coming from. Rather than looking at them as just one giant group entity, look at them individually and see where they're coming from and see what, their side. After following those guidelines, and you still have to commit a necessary sin to achieve that goal, then as far as Peter Temes is concerned, go for it. And I think that's incredibly interesting because for me, of course, I hope that everyone going into leadership wants to be a moral and ethical and quote unquote good leader, and whatever that means in your context. No one, I hope, has a goal of being immoral or unethical or evil or committing bad acts. So I kind of had this thought of course I'm just going to always be moral and ethical. But that's not life. That's very one extreme to the other. And of course, everything in my opinion is a spectrum or is more complicated than that, or is, life is this beautiful technicolor craziness. And so you're not always going to be able to not get your hands dirty in life. And is putting your own moral and ethical well-being above your followers' needs actually moral and ethical? If I'm saying as a leader, let's say I have a bunch of followers, constituents, let's say I'm a politician and I have constituents that need cleaner water, and in order to get cleaner water, I have to make a deal with someone I don't like, who maybe is evil and terrible and everything that I hate about a person. If I refuse to do a deal with them just because I think they are mean or awful, but that ends up hurting my constituents, am I actually doing the moral and ethical thing? And of course there is no one answer. Every situation is going to be different. But I do like these guidelines. I like that it's kind of, you can check these boxes, then yeah, go get your hands dirty. Do the necessary sin in order to get this done, because that is what leadership is. It's a weight and balance. It's doing what's best for your followers. It's having to make sacrifices. It's taking every situation as unique as it is and figuring out what the best is that you can do in that situation. And so, yeah, so that's what I read this week. I thought it was very interesting because, again, I started it kind of shocked about pacifists, and I always thought pacifists were these, very enlightened, and most of them probably are. But if you're a pacifist to the extreme that you're willing to allow others to suffer, are you actually ethical and moral? And that was just a very interesting conversation for my fiance and I to have. And so, I'm curious your guys' thoughts about it. I'm curious about the other side of being a moral and ethical leader. Sometimes you can't always do good. You can't always expect that every situation is just it's going to be easy, one, to tell what the ethical and moral path is. Two, you might have to push aside your own ethical and moral standards to do what's best for your followers, which is the most moral and ethical thing to do. Three, you can't allow extreme suffering of others at, your moral and ethical well-being should not always come at the cost of suffering of others. And so sometimes you have to get your hands dirty and do a deal to do what's best for your followers. Or, as the extreme case of World War II that my fiance brought up, the moral and ethical thing to do was to go to war because people were suffering and were being murdered. And so yeah, that's what I went through this week. I know that is completely different than the mindfulness of the 2 weeks prior, but I thought it was a very interesting conversation that I wanted to start on YouTube, and kind of what I'm going through right now is thinking about that. And so that was, again, Quest for Moral Leaders, Chapter 6, Peter Temes. It's a very interesting chapter. I really would recommend a lot of people read it. It's kind of a unique perspective on moral and ethical leadership. So, yeah. Until next week, everyone, thank you for joining, and like and comment or subscribe to the channel. And I appreciate any feedback you have. Bye.